Hello, everyone. My name is Harold Trinkinis. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. It's my pleasure to welcome you this week to our weekly research seminar. And it's a terrific privilege to have with us here today Professor Eric Min from the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Min received his PhD in political science from right here at Stanford University, where he was also a Zuckerman Family Trust Fellow here at CSAC. So welcome back. We were just talking about that he was a fellow back in 2017, 2018. So it's really wonderful to welcome him back. Eric is also the 2020 Henry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Distinguished Scholar. His research interests focus on using machine learning, text, and statistical analysis to understand interstate war, diplomacy, and decision-making. He'll be talking to us today about his paper, Keeping It Professional, Language of Bureaucracy in the Cold War, which he co-authored with Professor Austin Carson from the University of Chicago. It's very nice to welcome back Professor Carson, at least virtually, to us. He last spoke at CSEC on one of his books. So, Mr. Carson, wonderful to have you back with us as well. So without too much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Min. Just some reminders on the rules of the game, so to speak. We will be having a presentation by Professor Min for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A, a moderated Q&A. I'll moderate. You can ask your questions if you're joining us virtually via the Q&A function in Zoom, and I will add your questions into the mix together with the folks in the room who will be asking questions as well. And Professor Garson, I believe, will be joining us for the Q&A as well. So Eric, over to you.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Harold. And thank you to everyone for being here, both in person and anyone who's here virtually. I heard that this is the first in-person event, perhaps, to take place in CSAC in a while, so I'm honored to be part of that kind of welcome back session. And as Harold mentioned, we're really happy to be presenting to you somewhat early work, where we're really interested to hear any feedback or thoughts or comments you have on this paper called Keeping It Professional, Language and Bureaucracy in the Cold War. By way of motivating why we were interested in this project and what this project is doing, one thing we noticed when we looked at the series of presidential daily briefs that have been declassified by the government, and we'll talk more about that data set in a little bit, but just to kind of set the scene. When you look at some of these presidential daily briefings that have been distributed by the United States government, especially in the early history of the document, what you notice is that the language that's used in these documents seems to transform or sort of morph over time. If you look at this entry from the PDB in November 23rd of 1965, like 4 years into the PDB's existence, you see an example of a discussion of developments in Buenos Aires and Argentina. What I would note is the use of some informal language in the description of developments in the country, saying that there's a sticky situation that is brewing in Buenos Aires, and that someone's resigned in a huff, and that the president has not yet grasped this hot potato of an issue going on in Argentina. If you fast forward about 11 years and look at the same document talking about the same country, you see that the way in which the country is discussed and the events going on in the country are discussed has fundamentally changed. I'm not going to read this verbatim, but what we can see is that this informal language has all but disappeared. It's a lot more technical and kind of straightforward language that's being used in these documents. Now, obviously, we could have just picked 2 examples that seem to kind of show this contrast, and who knows what that really tells us. However, as we will show, and as we'll explain in greater detail later in this presentation, this pattern where language seems to shift and in many ways seems to become less lexically diverse over time holds across the history of the PDB sort of writ large. So what you do, or what you find if you analyze how diverse the kinds of words being used in these documents are as a function of time, what you find is that as the years go by of the PDB's existence in its first 16 or 17 years, that the number of unique words basically being used in these documents is gradually falling. Right? And if you kind of put this best fitting line over it, you see this kind of negative drift in the variety of words being used in these documents. So what we're trying to explain in this project is what helps to explain this sort of pattern. How can we understand this trend in this foremost intelligence document being created by the United States intelligence agencies? our argument is that a key factor to explain this is the bureaucratization of the US national security kind of institutions and organizations. What we want to argue is that what's happening in the PDBs, as I've shown, and as we'll come back to later in this presentation in a little bit greater detail, is that this drop in the diversity of words being used in the documents reflects a change in how bureaucracies are interpreting the world. And we're going to use a term that's established in organizational literature called organizational sensemaking to refer to the dynamic that we are observing in these data and how they're reflected in these data. Now, you might ask why this matters beyond just us thinking it's interesting, or why do we find it interesting? Well, there's maybe 2 or 3 reasons we would put out. One reason might be that language, and however it's used, can lead to misunderstandings. And obviously, miscommunication, even within the government, can have major consequences, and it might be useful for us to understand how that might play out. In one kind of classic example of this, during the lead up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the executive committee was trying to figure out what to do about Russia and whether they could try to do kind of strikes against kind of Russian missiles, the ExComm basically asked the intelligence community whether Soviet missiles were operational. And the intelligence community said, yes, they are operational. Now, when they said that it was operational, what they meant is that these missiles could literally be fired. They were saying nothing about whether they were armed with nuclear warheads. However, the executive committee didn't interpret it that way. They thought operational meant that they were nuclear armed. Right? So this kind of miscommunication, because of the different languages and sort of jargon that's used by different organizations, can have major consequences. And we think it's important to try to problematize and investigate the evolution of jargon and dual meaning within bureaucracies over time. Because if different organizations have these different languages that they develop in how they communicate and think about the world, that can affect the kind of decision making that is made for good or for ill. Moreover, taking one step further back, we have to acknowledge that the language that people use, or the language they choose not to use, can affect how policymakers and leaders kind of receive information, how they act upon the information, how they see the world, in essence. Even in the last few days, when we've seen what Russia's been doing with Ukraine, people might talk about whether it's an invasion, a war, a dispute, a spat, etc. And all of those different terms come with different sets of meanings or interpretations or kind of views about how to see the world, and harbor different ideas about what should be done in response. So understanding where that language comes from, we think, is really important. And then lastly, we think that the ability to kind of label what's going on in the world and to talk about things using language reflects a really important form of power that bureaucratic actors have. So we want to better understand the origins of that power and how it might evolve over time. So I don't want to spend too much time on the existing literature that we're sort of building upon, but I do want to give a little bit of background. We see 2 main pools of literature, especially in international relations literature, that we think are relevant to what we're trying to do. The first one is a large literature in international relations on bureaucracies. We all know the work, classic work by Graham Allison back in the day about bureaucratic politics, and certainly that's been highly influential in the field. And building on Allison's ideas, many others have argued that bureaucracies, while they might sort of be working towards some common goal, have their own parochial interests. Right? They might be sort of jockeying for power amongst themselves. And what a lot of these scholars point out is that information and sort of hoarding information is a form of bureaucratic competition. It's a way of bureaucracies to leverage their influence in policymaking and to get the ear of the president or the leader or policymaker, etc. We also see a lot of people talking about how bureaucracies sort of might form in somewhat haphazard ways, leading to bureaucratic dysfunction, which in turn can affect communication between bureaucracies inside a government, having major consequences on intrastate communication. Obviously, Amy's work's highly important here, and in the last 10 years or so, there's been a real groundswell of additional literature on bureaucracies and bureaucratic actors in international relations. Briefly, we might also care about the role that leaders play in international relations too, and there's been a lot more active research here in the last couple decades as well. What many people have pointed out, which should seem somewhat intuitive, is that leaders are people. People have their own personalities, preferences, neuroses, etc. And for that reason, they might differ in the way that they want information, how they seek information, how they're willing to delegate authority to other people to give them information and to seek information. And then many leaders are also political actors, which means that they might have incentives to try to distort information or to only see what kind of confirms their priors, and that they can create an environment in which information is not necessarily sort of flowing in a quote unquote objective way, whatever that might mean. So there's a couple different ways in which we want this project to move things forward beyond this existing literature. One is to kind of look at the origins of bureaucracy sort of at their kind of foundations. What a lot of these works do, and of course I'm oversimplifying, so excuse me, but one thing that much of the bureaucracy literature does is take bureaucracies as a given and then analyzes what these bureaucracies that just sort of exist do in terms of affecting foreign policy or whatever outcome we might care about. However, we want to understand the path through which bureaucracies sort of become the bureaucracies that we know them to be right now through this process of bureaucratization. Moreover, going back to what we talked about, miscommunication is a huge consequence that might play out through the language that bureaucracies use. However, the form of miscommunication we want to analyze is the miscommunication that might take place because of linguistic confusion, right? That form of miscommunication between interstate actors, rather than any structural problems or other kind of standard operating procedure issues that might exist within bureaucracies. And then lastly, one thing we really want to be able to analyze in this sort of project is not just whether and how information flows between government actors inside of a government, but what kind of information flows. What are the actual words? What's the language that's being used to communicate messages from one actor to another? So with that in mind, let me talk a little bit about the theoretical approach that's driving the actual analysis and study that we're trying to do. So the main question that's kind of overarching this entire endeavor is what shifts the language that bureaucracies use when they assess foreign policy. Now, I hope it's not too controversial to say that one of the primary roles that bureaucracies play, especially in foreign policy, would be attempting to make sense of foreign events, foreign actors, foreign developments, etc. And in particular, we often care about what bureaucracies have to say and kind of what they contribute when they deal with things that seem unfamiliar, novel, sort of go against standard expectations, where we want to make sense of what's going on. Now, this is where scholars in organizational literature have come up with this term of sense-making to describe the process by which bureaucrats do this interpretation of novel, ambiguous, or confusing issues, events, developments, etc. Intuitively, what that means is that oftentimes experts who know something about what's going on that might be confusing to people are trying to use their knowledge, their structures, their paradigms of the world to impose order on what might at first glance seem like chaos and uncertainty. We're trying to make sense of the world, and the process by which that happens, we could call sense-making. Now, of course, whenever we try to interpret the world, either for ourselves or when we try to communicate what we want to say to other people, that obviously takes place through language. Language is the raw material by which sense-making takes place. It's by using words, whether it's written or spoken, that you shape perceptions either for yourself or for other people. And then by way of that, the decisions and actions that you take based on the language that you've used to describe the situation and impose order on this seeming chaos. So our contention is that the standardization of the language that bureaucracies use is a key part of the bureaucratization process itself. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail about what bureaucratization means, like in terms of extensive definitions. We can talk about it in the Q&A if you're interested. For our purposes, we're going to say that bureaucratization refers to the extent to which administrations or organizations have jobs that are appointed on merit, as opposed to just sort of personal connections or whatever the case might be. The extent to which they're organized by a centralized hierarchy. The extent to which that they are autonomous in being able to make the decisions and kind of doing the things they need to do. And the extent to which they are governed by written rules, right? Pre-written rules that you're supposed to follow, as opposed to making sort of ad hoc adjustments on a case-by-case basis. So the more you kind of check off these boxes, the more bureaucratized you are. Now, bureaucracies, as they become more bureaucratized, we contend are going to start narrowing the language that they use in their documents or whatever they're producing for both direct and indirect manners. There's two different mechanisms by which this takes place. Now, the direct mechanism might not be too surprising, which is that as the number of people working in an organization or a bureaucracy grows, there might be more of an interest in standardizing the language that people use so that everyone kind of gets what everyone is saying inside the bureaucracy. There's a desire for this fixing of meanings as more and more people are working together towards some goal within an organization. The other mechanism that's indirect really points to professionalization. And this one links back to the idea that if you're bureaucratizing, you kind of pick people more on merit and on technical expertise. As an organization becomes more professionalized and as they privilege competence and expertise as the criteria they use to hire people, the more they're going to bring in people who already have sort of this language that they might have adopted from other communities that they're bringing in to talk about the world. Right, so sort of in an indirect manner, as bureaucracies grow and as they privilege this competence and expertise, the more their language is going to narrow because they're bringing in people who already have some of these pre-established ideas in their heads. So regardless of which mechanism you go through, an implication of all of this is that the more an organization becomes bureaucratized, the more standardized their language should be, and the more the lexical diversity of what they're writing should also go kind of down as they talk about and interpret foreign events. So that's the theoretical argument. And what we're trying to do is to kind of justify these claims using two different methods, one being quantitative and one being a little bit more qualitative. I'm going to spend a lot more of the time about speaking about the quantitative work, because in some ways we think it's the more sort of novel and interesting contribution in analyzing language in bureaucracies. But we'll also talk about the qualitative aspects of how we can kind of look to the actual mechanisms and understand whether this connection between bureaucratization and language is actually happening in the way that we're arguing that it is. So let me speak a little about the quantitative methods that we try to use to address this question. As I already suggested at the opening of this presentation, we have access to several thousand presidential daily briefings that were distributed between June 17th, 1961 and January 20th, 1977. June 1761 is the first day that the PDB was distributed. Now, at that time, it was called the President's Intelligence Checklist, or the PICL, but that's still basically the same document that's evolved to this day. And we have that information all the way to the Ford administration. These documents were declassified by the CIA in 2016. Up until that point, we didn't have access to this stuff except for a smattering of declassified documents here and there. So this was a big kind of surge of data for us to analyze for this premier document that the intelligence community created on a nearly daily basis. Here's one more screenshot of what a PDB might look like. The excerpts I showed at the start of the presentation are also directly from PDBs. Now, when these PDBs were distributed, the CIA just published a bunch of PDF files. So the first step we had to take was to apply a lot of OCR, optical character recognition software, to these documents, and then do some manual cleaning of the text that came out, because the OCR process is not perfect by any means. And that allowed us to create this full data set of basically all the text that was published in these PDBs between 1961 and 1977, which we think is already pretty exciting, just the fact that this data exists. But for our purposes, we want to be able to look at the connection between bureaucratization and lexical diversity with these PDBs. So how do we do that? In order for us to tackle that, what we're doing is taking each one of these presidential daily briefings, and we're going to calculate a measure of lexical diversity that's called a measure of textual lexical diversity, or the MTLD. Not a very creative name, but it's very direct about what it's trying to do, obviously. Now, we can go into a little bit more detail about why we chose this particular measure later if anyone's interested. For us, it just suffices to say that the MTLD is a pretty standard measure in linguistics. And one of its strengths is that it's robust to different lengths of text. Some other measures of linguistic diversity that are out there are highly sensitive to whether you're looking at shorter pieces of text or longer pieces of text. The MTLD is specifically designed to be able to kind of map on in an equal way, regardless of how long or short a piece of text is. But the simplest description of what the MTLD is doing is basically looking at how many unique words are being used inside a document while accounting for text length. And the higher an MTLD is, that means the more kind of unique words are being used, the more lexically diverse a piece of text is. Lower values means it's less lexically diverse, right? A more common pool of words being used in a document. So if we calculate the MTLD for the nearly 5,000 PDBs we have, we get these two plots. The one on the left is basically just the same plot I showed at the start of this presentation, except compressed a little bit. And once again, I'll note that there's this sort of downward trend that you can see in this diagram. And in case it's not clear, on the right-hand side, we have low S-curve versions of the data where we've kind of applied this local linear regression. And it shows in a little bit more clear term how there's been this constant downward trend, essentially, in the lexical diversity of the PDBs. Now, alongside that, we need to have some kind of measure of the actual kind of size of the bureaucracy or the complexity of the bureaucracy. What we do to gauge that is look at organizational charts from the CIA. Now, these organizational charts come from a variety of sources, including FOIA requests and other archives where people have been able to find these charts. Here's one example of a chart from, I believe it's 1963. So what we do with each of these charts is create a couple measures that we think are plausible proxies for how complex the intelligence bureaucracy is in any given time when we have this chart. One is to just look at the number of boxes that are on these charts, which we think reflects the number of positions that the CIA believes are important to understanding its bureaucracy and its structure. So that is just a boxes per chart measure, pretty straightforward. But we might also think that the number of words that are displayed on these charts is also a reflection of how complex the bureaucracy is. Maybe longer titles means something about the increasing complexity of the organization. So for our second measure, we also count the number of words on each one of these charts. We add that to the number of boxes on these charts, and we create what we call this bureaucratic index. These two plots show what these two measures look like across the span of our data between 1961 and 1977. Not too dissimilar. Now, one thing I do want to note, because it's obvious here, is that there's several points in these data where the measure is just horizontal. It doesn't seem to change. And that's simply a reflection of the fact that we do not have organizational charts for every single year in our data. They sort of come in bursts. So what we're doing for the purposes of our current analysis is whenever we have a year where we don't have an organizational chart, we're just saying the last measure that we are able to find, we're just going to keep applying until we get a new organizational chart where we can update our understanding of the CIA. However, there's obviously potential issues with this, and this is one of those places where we're very eager to hear any suggestions you might have about alternate measures of bureaucratic complexity, because I think that's one place where we could develop things a bit further. But this is what we have, and we think it's a plausible way of approaching things, at least for our initial cut. So to look at the relationship between bureaucratic complexity and lexical diversity as we define them, we use a series of ordinary least squares regressions. And obviously, there might be a concern that there's a bunch of other factors that influence why these PDBs become more or less lexically diverse that have nothing to do with bureaucracy. And we try to control for as many of those as possible in our analysis. Now, this is not a comprehensive list, but it's some of the heaviest hitters, at least in our view. We control for things like the number of entries or topics being discussed in each PDB, because the PDB is the level of analysis here. We look at the number of armed conflicts taking place around the world, either involving the US or not involving the US. We count the number of entries on Vietnam, because our qualitative understanding of the PDBs is that when they talk about Vietnam, they often become much longer, and we want to account for that, especially in the peak of the US's involvement in the Vietnam War. We have fixed effects for administration. We also include a control for readability, where we measure something called the Flesch-Kincaid reading scale on these entries to make sure that our results are really about how diverse of words are being used in the PDB and not about how readable the PDB is, which is a separate concept. And then we also include a linear time trend to try to account for any changes that might just be happening over time, whether it's increasing or decreasing. So the main results are displayed right here. And basically, the point that we want to make is that regardless of which model you use, whether you're looking at boxes or a bureaucratic index, whether you include controls or not include controls, the conclusion is pretty much the same, which is that as bureaucratic complexity increases, we see that it has a negative relationship with the diversity of the language that's being used in the PDBs that are being produced. And if you crunch some numbers, you see that across the range of kind of bureaucratic complexity we see in the data, it's associated with approximately a 5 to 7% decrease in terms of the MTLD measure. So a somewhat sizable kind of decrease in how diverse of language is being used in this very important document that's being distributed by the intelligence agency. Now, there's several alternate explanations or things we might be concerned about that we think could plausibly be affecting this decreasing lexical diversity that have nothing to do with bureaucracy. We try to control for some of those in our analysis, but there might be a concern that some bigger structural or external cultural changes might actually be influencing this downward trend. Many people talk about this dumbing down of English. Maybe people are just getting stupid and don't use as sophisticated of language, right? Maybe that has nothing to do with bureaucracy. It's just about us. So we want to be able to address whether that's a plausible alternate explanation or not. And we want to give a couple examples, to suggest that this is not a significant concern, that we actually are picking up something interesting regarding bureaucratization. One way we can address this is to look at the speeches that these 4 presidents were giving at the same time that these PDBs were being created and see whether the trends we see in terms of decreasing linguistic diversity hold for these speeches that the presidents are giving as well. And this is timely since President Biden will be giving the State of the Union later tonight. If you do the same exercise of calculating the MTLD for each of these speeches, what you find is that the patterns do not align with what we saw for the presidential daily briefings. In fact, for the first 3 presidents in the data, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, there is no meaningful difference in the diversity of the words that they use in their speeches. And then during the Ford administration, you see a huge upward jump in lexical diversity, even though in the PDB data, we see actually a pretty steep decline in lexical diversity during the Ford administration. So there's not a one-to-one correspondence here between administrations and the language that's used within them, at least kind of captured by speeches and the PDBs produced. Taking one step further back, we might also look at language that's being used by the media and sort of by the public, or at least sort of the educated levels of the public in the New York Times. What we did here is we took the entire corpus of the New York Times between 1961 and 1977, and just for the sake of being able to compute something without causing problems to a computer, we took a random sample of 5% of all articles that were published at this time. And that's a total of 96,400. That's the 5% sample is 96,400 because there's many, many, many articles published during that 17-year period. Yes. All articles. We removed op-eds and classified ads and everything, but we left all articles just to kind of see what the language is like that's being used in the newspaper itself outside of foreign policy, or regardless of foreign policy, excuse me. What you find here is this kind of dotted mess, but if you put this low S line on it again, what you find is that over time, it actually seems that over 1961 to 1977, lexical diversity steadily increases, at least to a small extent, in the New York Times data. And it's quite interesting if you map this alongside the MTLDs and how they evolved in the PDBs. So this green line on the bottom is just a replication of the New York Times line. And then the pink line on top is the PDBs and how they're evolving. And what you note, first of all, like I said, is that the Times is increasing lexical diversity. But also, by sometime in the early 1970s, the levels of lexical diversity seem to be pretty similar between the PDBs and the New York Times. What we think this might suggest, and we're only kind of postulating, we need to dig into it further, is that this could be an indication that by the early 1970s, the intelligence bureaucracy has finally reached a point in terms of their bureaucratization where the language that they're using has become as standardized as the language being used by journalists in this institution that's been around for a lot longer. So maybe they finally sort of figured things out and are on parity with the sort of standards that journalists might have in kind of hemming down their language. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that the language that the PDB and New York Times are using are similar, or that they're using the same words or using them in a similar way. All we're pointing out is the size of the pools of words they're using have become roughly equivalent by the early 1970s, which we think is noteworthy. So briefly, I want to talk a little bit about qualitative evidence for these mechanisms as well. What we found during our research process is a series of declassified CIA commentaries and essays that have to do with writing and official guidance in writing in the intelligence community. And we think that they give us an opening to understand the logic of why an increasing bureaucracy led to this demand for more standardized language. If you look at some of these documents from the early 1960s, what you find is that many intelligence analysts start lamenting the fact that the documents that their organization is creating is undisciplined and that it's not standardized. And one quote from one of these documents says there's little talk about how to write a contact report, an intelligence information report, a dispatch, or a study. In another essay, someone mentions that the intelligence community is just writing a thick paste of words, right? Lots of euphemisms, cliches, not very meaningful. And the person asks who is in charge of actually enforcing the style manual of the agency. What you see is that one of the reviewers of this essay writes in the margin, what style manual? Right? There isn't one, or at least not to the person's knowledge. And it's not until probably the late 1970s or so that we see the publication of an actual style manual or a style guide for intelligence publications, some of these more rigorous standards about how language is supposed to be used to impose some order on what might be this thick paste of words. And we think that this shows evidence of a desire for a shift from idiosyncratic writing to more standardized writing. Okay, so I think we're running low on time, so I'll just kind of wrap things up quickly. What we want to show in this project is that language, even in this declassified, highly important intelligence document, has become less diverse, more systematized, and more constrained over time. There might be a variety of reasons this could happen. Our argument is that it has a huge connection with the deepening bureaucracy of the intelligence, kind of community in Washington, D.C., and that it really reflects basically bureaucratization as opposed to the other kind of external events or cultural shifts that people might think would be reflected in all written materials around that time. And all of this matters because, as we said over and over, changes in organizational sense-making, the kinds of words and ideas people use to make sense of the world, affect how we perceive the world and how we act upon the world. So looking forward, some potential future steps we want to engage in the project include developing other measures of bureaucracy, like I'd mentioned previously, analyzing differences in actual usages of words. As I discussed with the New York Times versus PDB data, we haven't yet looked at how words being used in bureaucracies might kind of diverge from what the general public says or how the meanings of those words evolves over time. We think that's also a part of bureaucratization, and we'd be interested in looking at that. And we also want to find evidence and discuss evidence of some of the actual downstream policy consequences of what we're discussing in this paper. Right, we think this paper is important because it's sort of proving the point that this stuff is happening. And we really want to make the case that this stuff matters. And we're going to look for other ways of making that case a little bit more forcefully in the future. And then any other suggestions you might have to improve or build upon this work would also be appreciated. So with that, I thank you for your time so far. And Austin and I will be happy to take any questions, comments, suggestions you might have. Thank you very much. Oh, sure.
And thanks very much. I think we're on the site.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you very much, Eric, for a terrifically interesting presentation. We'll start taking some questions. I'm very tempted to use a moderator's privilege to ask the first couple of questions. So I think I will.
All right.
But I see a number of hands up around the table, and I'll make a note. So while I was listening to your presentation, I thought of whether you'd considered a couple of alternative explanations. Um, the first is, as we've discussed here, uh, thinking back to your fellowship days, briefing principles like presidents and the way that briefers adapt themselves to presidents. Like more visuals or more maps, like President Trump, and whether that might affect the lexical diversity in the PDB. And secondly, whether the change you're seeing might actually reflect a change in the background of people joining the CIA. The CIA, I think, famously, right after World War II, was sort of a Yale-Harvard club of upper-class males with a certain educational background, and maybe the language from that first example you gave very much struck me as having that kind of sensibility. And maybe as the CIA expands and has
I do think that we can sometimes think about how briefers might adjust to the president. Certainly qualitatively know that that's the case, where there's a storied history of how with every administration the briefers have had to adjust policy and adjust course, realizing what preferences they have. The sort of lazy answer in some sense is that in the quantitative analysis, at least, we're hoping that including these like administration fixed effects to some extent captures some of the systematic differences that exist in how diverse the language is, depending on which president is in office. But I guess we haven't gone much deeper than that, at least in terms of the actual empirics that we've done. As for the background of the people joining the CIA, that's an interesting thought. Austin, I don't know if we've actually talked that much about it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Can anybody hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great.
yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think my first reaction to that was it might be framed as part of the bureaucratization process, that it shifts from a more sort of who you know network-based recruitment process to one which draws on a slightly more meritocratic, but of course we would never say fully, way of drawing on human resources. And I think that would be one way to think about that as maybe part of our story, although I don't want to subsume everything into our theory. That's my first reaction.
Great, thank you. So I've seen Deepak, Jim, Sana, Gorak. Let's start with Deepak then.
Thanks a lot for this fascinating talk. And so I'm Debak. I'm a Stanton Nuclear Security postdoctoral fellow over here at CSAC. I had a question along the lines of what Harold just asked about the precedents, but I was interested more at whether the educational background of the president made a difference across the four precedents that you saw. Like, we know famously that, Trump couldn't read at all. So you had to have very brief, like Twitter-like messages, right? So preferences of precedents, but do you have something a bit more systematic, looking at Democrats or Republicans or educational background, or some of those traits leading to certain changes in the way that the information is being packaged for the consumer?
Yeah, so my sense is that Austin and I have talked about this to some extent, and I guess we weren't sure whether it would be part of this particular study, like whether the kind of actual background characteristics of the president kind of lead to an adjustment in the media that is used and this kind of formulation of stuff. Although the way you discuss it, it sort of seems like it could or should play a part in sort of understanding it. I don't think we've done any specific analysis after that or collected data in that manner. Their background might be like Harold's point, but also the background of the individual. I don't know how much variation. I guess there'd be more variation if we were able to also extend the timeline a bit more beyond 61 to 77, but I do think we could probably think through that a bit more.
Great. Let's go to Jim Goldgeier next, maybe, and then
Great. Hi, thanks so much for this. I'm Jim Goldgeier. I'm a visiting scholar here at CSAC, a former pre-doc postdoc from back in the day. So super interesting. I just sort of wanted to push a little bit on the meaning of greater bureaucratization. I mean, I'm just trying to think about, I mean, what you're referring to. I mean, I was really struck, of course, by the first one on Argentina, the whole hot potato thing and all of that. I mean, you're to the second one, right? You're seeing much greater precision in the type of language, which suggests much greater professionalism, and perhaps differences in training. I mean, maybe by the time you get to the 1970s, you're trained not to use terms like hot potato. I was also curious, so I will reveal tremendous ignorance. I did not learn this until last year. I always thought, when I would hear about the PDB, I always thought it meant that someone was standing up there the way you were standing up there, and the president, top advisors were around, they were listening to the PDB. I did not realize there was a team of people giving the PDB, and they were assigned to different parts of the White House. I didn't know this until last year when I met with somebody who used to work for me, and she was, during the Trump years, she was assigned to provide the PDB to the chief of staff and several other people. So I didn't know, I just didn't know that. And I was just curious, how far that goes back, because I guess that just was a different way. I didn't realize that there was a team providing this to different members of the president and different members of the team, as opposed to like one session with the group every morning or something like that. And so whether there's a change over that in time. Curious in what you found, whether there's any change or whether there's anything to say with respect to presidential requests for estimates, probabilistic estimates, and whether or not there is either greater reluctance or greater willingness to provide probabilistic estimates, because I would think that would be super interesting. And also whether you're thinking at all, I mean, I realize the time frame for you is from when you can get the actual PDBs, but just whether you're planning to talk to any people who have given the PDB, just as a way of fleshing out your own understanding of the whole process. Thanks.
No, thank you so much for being here as well. As for the initial point about sort of briefing and how that happens, Austin, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember specifically the Kennedy administration when it was more in its infancy and it started as the pickle and just kind of got handed out. But certainly, I think by the Johnson administration, we got to a point where the president could sort of list the confidants that he was willing to share the PDB with. And then each one of those principals could be given that's briefing separately or ask for any information they want and have the briefer come in and give it to them to supply extra context to the PDB that they all still receive. And I think that part has been relatively consistent in the sense that the principals can ask for that information, at least since Johnson, if not at some point in the early stages of the Kennedy administration as well. As for presidential requests for estimates, that's interesting. I don't think we've looked at that. And part of, I think what you might be pointing to would be finding documents about like what principles or the president himself is requesting, like in terms of actual additional information following up on the PDB and sort of information searching. I'm not sure what documents out there would allow us to systematically measure that right now, but I do think it would be useful to look into it. We could maybe look at other documents sort of outside the PDB context where the White House sort of asked for other information, but I think we'd have to dig into that more.
What estimates is given.
Oh, inside the PDB itself? Oh yeah, no, certainly. Then I think the answer is we haven't looked at that as much, although that makes a lot of sense to kind of look at whether the willingness to give those estimates changes over time or administration or topic. No, I think we should definitely look into that, and that is something that is more doable and would be interesting. Sure, yeah, Austin.
Yeah, let me just jump in there. Thanks for those comments, Jim. Great to be thinking about these. The one thing this does bring to mind, which we haven't analyzed, but I remember from reading them, is that in the Ford years, there was a request to have factual information versus analytic judgments formatted differently. So in these PDBs, you would actually see like italicized sections when there was sort of an interpretive move going on, and then non-italicized when it's more recap of factual. So one possibility is that that reflects more of an attentiveness to the added layer of interpretation that takes place with intelligence analysis. And could that then affect the diversity of terminology? I don't know, but it certainly is an interesting formatting difference and style difference that I now think of when you mention that. So that's something that we could definitely look at more.
Great. Let's go now to Sana, and then Gaurav, and then I'll take a question from the online.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. So I have one question of clarification and three small points. So the first one is like, as a qualitative scholar, I'm trying to wrap my head around what does the change that you get in your regression actually mean substantively. So can we think about like what a 0.1 change up or down means in terms of what that looks like in those statements, if we can reflect a little bit about that. And then the second point is about what you controlled for Vietnam, but what about some of the other things that were taking place in the context of the Cold War at that time, and some of the things, maybe the big paradigms were kind of settling in, maybe that can account for some decrease as well, and the conflicts and everything was kind of like settling in some ways. So maybe that might be a cause as well. I don't know. And then I was wondering about different meanings, right? Like if I think about my own research, missile defense means very, very many different things. And so how can you account for the fact that these words might change meaning over time or might have very diverse sets of meanings behind it in these PDBs? And then finally, and this is like maybe a question, I don't know very much about it, but I was just doing a Wikipedia search, and like it turns out that there's lots of organizations that are involved in writing these briefings nowadays. So how was this historically? Who was involved in writing these briefings? And how do you think like some of the competitions, I mean, the intelligence agencies are kind of famous for not being able to coordinate super well. So like how does the coordination between these agencies could be reflected in these briefings? But fascinating talk. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. I can address at least, I think, the first 2 or 3 questions here. In terms of understanding what the regression results actually mean substantively, maybe I won't give the most satisfying answer, but I can still try, which is that what we're finding in our models is that when you go from sort of the lowest levels of bureaucratic complexity to the highest ones, in terms of the measures that we're using, what you're seeing is that the MTLD measure, the predicted MTLD measure, goes down by about 7 or 8, which means that, so in fighting the weak, but trying to simplify, reaches this threshold where words are starting to repeat themselves. So what that means is that between sort of the least complex to the most complex, it's taking like 8 fewer words to get to a point where the words are starting to repeat, where you kind of restart the counter. Now, I gave you the most literal version of what that means. I don't really know if that's really answering the question in a way that you would want. And maybe that calls for us to think of better ways to communicate like what exactly it means.
Just the way we think about like the rivalries in the Cold War. I mean, a lot of that was like setting more and more in stone as we progressed through the Cold War. So I can imagine that a lot of the discussions are starting to mimic each other, not due because there's a standardization of language, but because the external situation in which the US is positioning itself
Hmm.
is kind of becoming more fixed over time.
Okay, I see. Well, to some extent, I would say that the other controls we include, including like the militarized disputes that the United States is involved in, or the active conflicts taking place around the world, are at least in some measure accounting for these other developments, especially during the Cold War. So this is all happening in the Cold War. I mean, we could account for maybe things that are happening with the Soviets in general, but your kind of broader idea about maybe the conversation sort of ossifying and it's sort of kind of getting to a certain place, I think we'd have to think more about ways to capture that in a more, at least in the quantitative approach. Um, as for different meanings, that's actually speaking directly to one of the things that we might add in this paper or do in a different paper, where on the quantitative end, there's a tool called word embeddings, where you can look at how phrases or words are being kind of used based on the words that are surrounding it. And one of the things that we expect to see as a consequence of bureaucratization is that these terms that might exist in common like public discourse and in these bureaucratic language documents should diverge, right, in how they're being used. Right? The words that are surrounding them, the context in which they're being used should differ, and that it should drift sort of over time, ideally speaking, in terms of illustrating the kind of bureaucratization dynamic. That is something that we do want to pursue. We have the tools to do it. The question is whether it would fit here or sort of be its own separate endeavor. And then finally, for the responsibility of who writes the briefings, in the Kennedy administration, it really started as like a 2 or 3 person endeavor where, I mean, McGeorge Bundy helped kind of with formulating it. There was one guy who especially was responsible for writing it. His name eludes me. But that process certainly kind of started becoming larger over time. But Austin, do you have a better recollection of that process? It's sort of eluding me, like the evolution of it.
Well, I actually understood the question as also being about which organizations and entities are feeding information into the PDB. And so in that sense, it's important to note that it's been treated and called as an all source document, which means they're pulling in from different CIA offices, but also other agencies. And that's true of the document throughout its life. So I think that gives a little bit of context to that. One other thing, and then I want to shut up so we can get more questions, but Sana, you asked about the broader context of the Cold War. And one of the things I think that's puzzling about the pattern we find is certainly after 1973, when Vietnam ends, there's an increase in the diversity of the geographic issues and areas that are considered to be in US national security interests, but also issues like oil and oil security become on par with the sort of traditional quote unquote high security issues. So to see a continuing decrease to us suggests that there's something structural going on or institutional going on rather than a shift in the nature of the events in the external environment.
Thank you. Starting to get to the point where we're running out of time. So if we go to Gorak, a quick question, then I'm going to include a quick question from Eric Sapp online. So Gorak, to you.
So this is Gorak, and I'm visiting scholar here. So with my engineering background, I have more question on your like quantitative analysis that you use. So as like Sana mentioned, right, like sometimes like some differences in like your outputs, you can have different interpretation. So have you considered any model other than like simple least square model? Like there are tons of like complicated models, right, that can give you better predictions. And my second question is, so for your future work, you're trying to do like actual word uses analysis, right? What have been said and what you should interpret it. So are you considering again like any simple model to get some insights, or are you considering like more complicated models there?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, certainly we'd be interested in more complicated models. The least squares we're using right now are sort of a first cut. Are there any particular models you thought would be most fitting for this, or is that?
I mean, so I don't have like certain recommendation, but if we see AI and data science, right, or data analytics, so depending like needs and like what you want, there are many models available.
Sure. No. Certainly, I do think that there is an interest in us trying to make more robust models that go beyond sort of the OLS. For us, this is sort of a first cut to make sure that something is existing and that we can sort of build upon that. But yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay, thank you.
So let me take a question from Eric Sapp online. He asks, why do you frame this as bureaucratization rather than specialization? I.e. that the role of issuing PDBs develops consolidated rules and practices for that genre of report. Bureaucratization, on the other hand, could be consistent with a multiplicity of distinct, maybe inconsistent, specialized discourses, and one might think requires comparing lexical and stylistic diversity and changes between different offices. For example, comparing the PDBs with State Department cables or DoD reports over the same time period.
Austin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Actually, while you're thinking about
yeah.
this, let me throw in
Sure.
one other concept beyond specialization, professionalization,
Sure.
which is adjacent. I notice your measure of bureaucratization is very Weberian. There's also the favor on professions, and so you might think, is there a change in the ethics of the profession over time? Is there the training? So I think it's adjacent to Eric's question. Awesome.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. And one small sort of point that's relevant to this is that a lot of the items that are appearing in the PDB are not actually being written by independently and separately from the process of writing intelligence analysis more broadly. So in a way, one reason we think this provides a window into a broader change across the organization, rather than a particular unique writing style of, sort of the office of the PDB or Office of Current Intelligence, which is what was generally developing this, is because they're taking language and lifting it literally from these longer reports from specialized offices and desks and condensing it down into individual items. And so in that way, certainly there is a development of more systematized rules and practices that are specific to the PDB's production. But the stock of language, the pool of words, for example, if it's compressing in the broader intelligence community, should also translate into a compression in the linguistic diversity of the items that appear in the PDB. That's at least, I think, our thinking is that's a reasonable assumption.
You want to add anything, Eric? Or?
No, I mean, I guess one thing I am curious about is the extent to which, and Harold, I guess if your question was over professionalization, the extent to which you think that that should be a separate kind of concept from bureaucratization, because I know we're sort of tying that in as an aspect of bureaucratization.
Well, it would maybe get at this distinction between bureaucratization, which could also be getting more complex. There's more different offices, probably more different topics. Maybe the PDB initially focused mostly on war and peace, but eventually starts including things like economics, society, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas professionalization might be more to this the style book question, right? We're training intelligence officers to write in certain ways because that's the way we do it as professionals, right? And so that could change from an organization that is still closer to its infancy in 1961 to one that's maybe more mature in 1977. But there's certainly parallel processes, bureaucratization and professionalization. I could see those going together, and maybe that means that you don't need to treat professionalization as something different from what's going on. I just can imagine a divergence as well. Well, we've run out of time, unfortunately, and please join me in thanking Professor Min and Professor Carson for discussing a terrific paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for including me.